Looking for the best place to shop this Mother's Day? Go with the brand that makes it easy to send something thoughtful to everyone on your list. 1-800-Flowers.com. Right now at 1-800-Flowers, order 1 dozen roses and get another dozen free. More flowers mean more smiles, all backed by the quality, attention to detail, and trusted delivery experience that make 1-800-Flowers my top choice to send something beautiful Mom will love. Make Mom's Day at 1-800-Flowers.com/podcast. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/podcast.
This is Peter.
And this is Tom.
And you're listening to History Teachers Talking Podcasts. All right, this is Peter Zablocki and Thomas Reska, and welcome back to our podcast. Tommy, what do we got?
Well, today we're going to talk about something. I know we've thrown this around for a while, this particular individual, and he's definitely one that people might say, oh yeah, I kind of heard that story, but they probably don't know the whole story, and we're not going to be able to get into all of it, obviously, today, but it really is one of those, I guess, individual...
Kind of unbelievable.
Unbelievable, right? Was forgotten, sounds like a movie. I'm surprised there's not more movies about it, but I guess a lot of information didn't really come out until like the fall of the Soviet Union, which has also been a long time ago, so again, why is more of this information coming out? But we're going to be talking about an individual known as Witold Pilecki, and he basically was a Polish resistance fighter who voluntarily went into Auschwitz, started resistance there. He sent secret messages to the Western Allies, and he was the first to sound the alarm about the true nature of really what was going on in this, the largest concentration and extermination camp in Germany, which was Auschwitz. Occupied Poland, but not what the Nazis were doing. He basically sounded the alarm about it years before anything was done about it, before the camp was eventually...
Before the war ended even, yeah.
In 1945, yeah, before the war ended. He snuck in. He eventually sneaks out of Auschwitz, too.
Which is crazy. This whole story is just surreal to me. This is a person that volunteers to go into Auschwitz. Like you said, he creates this like hidden underground resistance within Auschwitz, starts passing messages to the Polish government in London, through which they are passed directly to the British SOE and the Allies, as to what is happening there. Eventually escapes Auschwitz and then compiles his whole report in 1943 as to what is happening in Auschwitz. He's talking about the gas chambers. He's talking about mass executions. This is all basically hand delivered to Churchill and Roosevelt. Like, this guy is like, this is what's happening. And no one really does anything about it. You know, and we'll get to it, but he has a pretty tragic end shortly after the war, too. So
dealing with all the repercussions and rise of communism in Eastern Europe. And he just kind of gets swallowed up by all that, yeah.
His actual report that he wrote was not really published until like the 2000s. Obviously, the nations had it, and it was in Library of Congress, I think, in the U.S. had a copy, but published for the public wasn't really until the 2000s. So I think we'll also get into, obviously, the idea of what Auschwitz was and what that was about. Most of us know just from studying about the Holocaust in our schools and just know because we know, but we'll get into a little bit more about what Auschwitz life was like, what was actually happening in Auschwitz, and then we'll get into Pilecki's story of, okay, who is this guy and how does he wind up being there, and then what does he do when he's there? So Auschwitz, I think that's a good way to start, right?
Yeah.
Probably the most infamous concentration camp.
It was one of... like when you think Holocaust and everything, that's always a lot of the footage is shown from Auschwitz, obviously, and a lot of that's the name that comes to mind, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
It was the largest.
It was because it had parts. A lot of people don't realize that. They think it's just one place.
Part. Yeah,
literally, you had Auschwitz I, which was the main camp. Then you had Auschwitz II, Birkenau, which was the concentration that was the extermination camp with gas chambers. That was designed specifically to kill people. And then you had Auschwitz III, which is more of like a labor camp. So all three, they also had like a dozen or so sub-camps on top of all that. So this became the fulcrum of the Nazis' final solution. The concentration camp, I mean, what would you call it?
Well, it's a death complex, whatever. Yeah, it was
complex. That was the word I was looking for. Most of it survives. Auschwitz I, Auschwitz II. I was there actually last month, touring it, and it's a pretty intense place, and that's an understatement. So Auschwitz, just so on the same page, was not located in Germany. It was located in German-occupied Poland. So Germany, real quick, invades Poland in 1939, and Auschwitz were actually army barracks originally, and it is converted in 1939, late 1939, into a prisoner of war camp. That's kind of how it starts. And the initial transport of detainees to Auschwitz in 1940 were political prisoners. Almost all of them were Poles. that were brought in, which is kind of plays a role as to why Pilecki ends up going in there. For the first like year and a half, 2 years, this was a basically like a prisoner of war, Polish prisoner of war camp. And that starts to shift like a year and a half, 2 years into becoming a essentially primarily a Jewish camp, and then eventually a Jewish extermination camp once the Auschwitz II, which
Yeah.
is literally minutes away from Auschwitz I, is built.
Yeah, what I saw, it followed the mold like a lot of other concentration camps later followed. Like pretty much what the Germans did is the first one, like it was constructed for three purposes. The first one was to really just to round up all the perceived enemies of the Nazi regime,
Mhm.
particularly started in Poland, right? Keep them there. Then it was to provide a source of forced labor for the SS, right? And all their enterprises, later on armaments for the war. And then the third part, which then became like the primary as the war evolved, was the services that basically like target and kill groups of a population whose death was determined by the SS. That this was essential to get rid of these people, part of the final solution to ensure the, as their mind, the security of Nazi Germany. So Auschwitz was kind of like the blueprint that the other camps would start to follow as time
Yep,
went on.
absolutely. And the first gassings, official gassings of Jews, initially actually started with Soviet and Polish prisoners, some of which were Jewish. And that happened in Block 11 of Auschwitz I. And Auschwitz I, as I mentioned before, if you go see it today, that was not the death camp. The death camp was down the road in Auschwitz II. But the first gassing started in Block 11, which is the infamous block of Auschwitz. And I'll get to it later. Auschwitz I, about August 1941. And shortly thereafter is when you have the construction of Auschwitz II that's completed. And from 1942 until late 44, basically Jews, as kind of as you alluded to, Tom, were brought from all over German occupied Europe to these gas chambers. Overall, they said about 1.3 million people were sent to Auschwitz, out of which 1.1 million were murdered in the gas chambers at Auschwitz. Close to a million were gassed right on arrival. You had
Yeah, even
seven,
able-bodied people, they just sent them right there.
yeah,
Like that's
absolutely.
basically what it became.
Overall, a lot of people may not know this, but there were at least 802, based on this research that I found, potential escapee, people that try to escape. So escape attempts, you would say. Out of those 800 escape attempts, 144 were successful. Real quick, Soviet army basically approaches Auschwitz in January of 1945, towards the end of the war, and they officially uncover something that what we are going to talk about today, technically our allies already knew about. And they flew sorties over this. Bombers flew over Auschwitz, right? And never did anything
They
about
were
it.
aware of it. Well, and there's a lot of conflicting reports there, and I get it's I guess we're not getting like super political or super
Of
people can
course.
have their own opinions on it one way or the other. We just like to give like the facts and information, but there's some documents and stuff, and obviously Roosevelt, Churchill knew about it, and some people say they had to be like they didn't care, and I mean I can't we don't know for certain,
I
but
was going to say, we can't get in their head. Yeah.
yeah, but a lot of the paperwork or some of the other, a lot of historians will argue that listen, they did care, but their belief was the best way to save these people is to win the war.
Yeah, to
That
defeat
was their.
Germany.
So we have to defeat Germany. Just to defend. And what are the bombing the camp wasn't really going to do anything. The argument also said because you're going to end up killing the prisoners there. Why are we going to
Mm.
bomb the camp? We don't have army units right there yet. So the best way to liberate them. I don't think they probably didn't know the extent. But you can make the argument for what Vitold tells them later on. Maybe they did know a
Yeah.
bit more. Who knows? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or maybe they just didn't believe it too. I mean, it's one of those things. So even when it came out, a lot of people were like, "Is this how does something like this happen?" Because he said the Russians liberated on January 27, 1945, and if you actually look, there's a small New York Times article. When I say small, it is a small New York Times article that says Russian Soviets liberate Nazi death camp, and that's it.
Oh, it's tiny. And I don't even think it
It's
made the front
small.
page.
No, it was like barely somewhere in the
Yep.
corner. It's maybe like a couple hundred words. That's it. That's all. That's really the only mention of Auschwitz for years until you get to the trials after the war. You don't really hear
Yeah.
about it much. It really doesn't become part of like the narrative with the Holocaust until years later after the war, when a lot more of this information is coming out and more of the survivors are starting to speak.
Nuts. So from Vitold, we kind of really learned as to the life in camps and what's really going on here. One thing I find it like kind of disturbing. One thing I find disturbing. Jesus, we'll talk about an
Kind of,
understatement.
yeah.
I know, what an understatement. Right, Rudolf Haas was the first commandant at Auschwitz. Right, 1940, he became the commandant. He moved in to Auschwitz with his family. Like, he brought his
Yeah.
wife and kids, and they lived in camp. Okay, like you bring your kids, but again, I guess to these people this was completely inhumane. But I guess to them this was
It
considered
was their
normal.
job. It was
Yeah, I
their
can't.
job. It was
Just
their
it's
duty.
nuts. It's nuts to me. About 6,335 people out of the 6,335. Most of them, over 6,000, were men. They worked it out. That worked at Auschwitz over the camp's entire existence. So you had over 6,000 workers. It's almost like what happened to the 6,000 workers at Auschwitz after the war. Most of them, well, like 4% were officers. 26 were non-commissioned officers, and then 60s, like 70% were rank and file. There were also 700 SS guards that were brought in, and as if you study history, the SS guards are considered some of the most cruel German soldiers. So let's kind of get into a little bit, I guess, how he makes it. Witold makes it in there, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the life itself, what life was like for the inmates and whatnot. Witold Pilecki, he was born into an aristocratic Polish family in a farming family in 1901. As a young man, and he was, late teens, early 20s, he fought the Soviets in the Polish-Soviet War, which kind of solidified Polish independence at the end of World War One. This is early 1920, 21. He earns a lot of citations for gallantry, becomes kind of like a war hero, but not huge that is known around Poland. He inherits family land shortly after World War One, and then he takes up basically life as like a country gentleman. He marries because, again, aristocratic family. He winds up getting married. He has 2 children, and he lives more or less as an aristocrat. Then the Nazis invade Poland in 1939 at the start of World War Two, basically beginning World War Two, and Pilecki is called back into military service due to the fact that he held a certain rank in the previous war. Poland winds up falling in about a month, and it's split by the Nazis and the Soviets. At that point, Pilecki goes into hiding and joins the first like underground Polish resistance
Yeah, the
movement.
Polish resistance. And I think it's important to talk about the Polish resistance a little bit because obviously the French resistance is very famous, and I'm not knocking the French resistance over there. But if you go to any like research that talks about it, in fact, over half of all the intelligence from the continental Europe to reach London came from the Polish underground. Most of that
Yep.
came from the Polish underground. It was the biggest operation in Europe. They provided the highest quality intelligence, the most prized. It always wound up being true. So most of the intelligence that the Allies got from behind German lines was from the Polish resistance. So again, not knocking the French. It's just one of those things that obviously the post-war world and everything like that, and with communism, the Cold War, the French get a lot of credit. And I'm not discrediting anything that they did, but most of the stuff came from the Poles. That's just that's just a fact. So it's not going to be that can't be argued. And it was really a lot about like their capacity, their war production. Like they knew detailed stuff, and it was because of people like Witold that they were able to get that information, that were risking their lives, going into these camps to get this information, and it just it helped with the war effort incredibly.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Just doesn't get
The
talked about
idea,
as much.
yeah, and the idea here too is because so many political prisoners are being sent to Auschwitz, some of them write letters back to their family members because actual prisoners were allowed to write letters as
Yeah,
long
yeah,
which is interesting because as long as the letters were in German, so they had to get people in Auschwitz in a camp to actually help them translate letters to their Polish families to write them in German because the rule was all letters had to be written in German, and they were all checked obviously upon leaving the camp. But letters start coming out of Auschwitz shortly after the fall of Poland that these political prisoners are arrested, and they're writing these letters to their family. So the Polish underground basically decides that, you know what, maybe like we need to figure out what is going on in this camp, like what this camp's
yeah,
about. And this is where he basically volunteers. And there's some stories
yeah.
as to why he volunteers. One of them is the fact that the initial Polish underground, before it evolves into the Home Army, at first it's known as TAP. It's not Home Army just yet. The early incarnation of it, the TAP, was a little bit too Catholic and too religious based, and Witold was like kind of against that. He's like, no, I think we need to encompass everyone that's against the Nazis, not just Catholics. It happens shortly thereafter. It turns into the Home Army, and it becomes all encompassing. But at these early stages of the war, it's not quite there yet. So Witold kind of is against what's happening there, and that partially people believe is why he's like, no, you know what, I'm kind of want to get out of this, so I'm going to volunteer. and I'm going to get myself arrested, and I'm going to get into Auschwitz, and I'm going to basically report back to the Polish underground what exactly is happening there.
That's what he does. Yeah. So on September 18th, 1940, he placed himself in the middle of a known Gestapo sweep, and he was
Mm-hmm.
sent to Auschwitz. And apparently, as soon as he gets there, he realizes, he wasn't really prepared to what he was going to experience. He
Yeah,
says he leaped out of a train car with hundreds of other men, and he was beaten with clubs immediately, as soon as they got there.
yeah,
And 10 men around him were randomly just pulled and shot. They were asking him, what their profession was. One guy said a doctor, so they just beat him to death right there. Right. Another person
nuts.
who, if they suspected anyone was Jewish, they just beat them right there, he was saying. So everything they had on them were stripped of them, they were shaved, and they were assigned numbers sent to prison camps. And that was the
Yep.
beginning of it.
Yep. And what's interesting too is when he arrived in Auschwitz, he actually arrived under a false name because again,
Yes.
this guy's kind of like a spy, more or less. And I mean, he is. So I think Serafinsky is the name he goes by here, and he's assigned a prisoner number 4859. It's interesting because as he infiltrates Auschwitz, he's actually promoted to first lieutenant by the Polish government in exile. They promote him for what he's doing. Now, this idea of a number, everyone kind of knows what number is about. It's kind of become a symbol of the Nazi oppression, how people that went to concentration camps were assigned a number. It was unique to Auschwitz, only in Auschwitz, that prisoners were tattooed with serial numbers on the left breast if they were Soviet prisoners of war. And then if you were considered a civilian, you were tattooed on the left forearm for any civilian. And then after that, you had categories of prisoners that were
Yeah, different
distinguishable,
ones.
right? By these different triangular pieces of cloth, they had this little triangle that were sewn into the jackets. So depending again if you're a political prisoner or not. So political prisoners, mostly Poles at the beginning, had a red triangle that was sewn in. Then you had criminals, whether they were from Germany, because a lot of war criminals were also brought in. Most of these were German. They were a green triangle. Any form of asocial prisoners, prostitutes, Roma, any form of prisoner that was not necessarily a criminal but a prisoner, or a black triangle. You had purple for Jehovah's Witnesses, pink for gay men, who were actually mostly German, ironically, that were brought in, and the Jews wore the yellow badge shaped as Star of David. So there was a distinction for each person that was there. It wasn't just Jews at the
Yeah,
beginning.
they wanted them to actually turn against each other too, just to get information
Yeah,
and stuff like that. That's one thing the SS are saying is, when they got there, they said none of you are leaving this place alive. He talks about there's one SS guard that said the rations have been calculated so you will only survive 6 weeks. That's it. And even though the mass gassings didn't begin yet when Witold was there, the crematorium was up and running, and they said the only way you're going to be out is after after you get cremated. And
yeah,
he talks about basically how prisoners are starving. Lice and bed bugs are all over the place. We're constantly on them. Typhus outbreaks were throughout the camp. And the work assignments where they've given these work, these were grueling days. And the guards delighted in punishing them, making things worse for them. So prisoners a lot of times stole from each other. They betrayed each other for scraps, literally just one more, this whatever left over and stuff like that. And he talks about how a lot of them were killing themselves just by jumping into the electric fence, just because
yeah,
they just couldn't take it anymore. And so he sees it, so he slowly starts to organize, this underground movement
hmm,
with a few people that he knew before the war, and it builds up. He actually has over nearly 1,000 people in this network that was designed to steal and distribute food, extra clothing, sabotage the plans, hide the injured and the sick prisoners, and he
yeah.
just, if nothing else, it basically improved the morale and kind of gave a sense of togetherness, of brotherhood, because he also was able to smuggle news in from the outside world, so he kind of got aware of what was going on outside of the camp. Because he
Yeah,
was in
no,
this
he's like
camp
running
for
an
2.5
underground
years.
network.
Yeah,
Yeah.
another network. So this is he's getting information in, he's letting people know, and they are actually trying to do as much as they can while they're there.
Absolutely. And while he's doing all this sets up this intelligent network. The reason is because a lot of people are coming in and out of the camp, bringing in food or other things. So it was all about paying people off. I mean, that's it's a bartering system, and
Yeah,
he kind of sets this idea of a bartering system in here.
like what you would
Um,
see in Schindler's List. It's very similar. The Nazis could easily be paid off, like anybody could.
absolutely. And just life for the inmates. I mean, the day began at 4:30 a.m. Right, so, out of his report. Supervisor sounded a big alarm. and basically would beat inmates that were unable to get up to the latrines quickly. And if you ever look at the latrine, like the bathroom is, it was, I mean, it was just one big row of holes where people would go and relieve themselves. There were, I think, 90 faucets and like sewer channels, but considering there was, and like 58 holes to go to the bathroom to in all of Auschwitz, and there was thousands of people there, so you could probably imagine. People are beaten all the time. You also had to, when you got up in the morning, you had to stand and wait for the officer to make sure that he did roll call, but it all depended whether the officer wanted to get there and what time he wanted to get there. So you would stand there for a really, really long time. Prisoners were not given any food. They received half a liter of coffee substitute, so it wasn't really real coffee, or some form of tea. You know, they were in rows, no matter what the weather. They waited for this SS person to arrive, tell them, "All right, you good to go?" And that's when they basically walked them out to work. I mean, this is if you were actually interned in Auschwitz. Because as we know, as Auschwitz continues, some people get there and literally are gassed right on the spot. You left, go to work, go right, you go here. And they brought them right into gas chambers. But those that survived ultimately worked every single day. And as you mentioned, they're given hardly any food. The idea is to basically work them about 11 hours long each day until they die. And they're just replaced with the next person, next prisoner. There was a very infamous prison orchestra that played right by the Auschwitz entrance, and above the gate, you know, you have the infamous saying that said "work means freedom." And these people in this orchestra was ordered to play cheerful music as these workers left the camp to go to work. Again, this is surreal. And you had another roll call in the evening, same premise. A lot of prisoners here, if you did something wrong during the day, that's when you were publicly hanged or flogged. If anyone was missing, the other people from that particular building had to remain standing until that absentee person was found. Sometimes that took hours. There was one particular event on July 6, 1940. The roll call actually lasted 19 hours because one prisoner had escaped. So they, you know, before they found him, and they made him stand for 19 hours. So very intense, as obviously expected, life in
Oh yeah.
Auschwitz that Witold's watching. But then he starts this radio thing, right?
When he starts
Did
reading, well,
you?
he also gets people out. Like there was one, I'm sure you saw Alexander Pilecki.
Yep.
So he was one of the early days, and he actually, his family, like we talked about before, was able to bribe and get him out. And rather than giving him papers, Vito makes him memorize the plan and all this information. He actually gets all the way to London, and he gives a message which basically was very blunt, said bomb Auschwitz. He even meant killing everyone inside. He said it would be merciful and that the Nazis had to be stopped. And this is in 1941, and before the United States was in the war. And the British
Yep.
Air Force was down to fueling like 200 planes, and they didn't have radar. The planes didn't have radar, and it kind of would stretch the limits of their fuel capacity. So the British didn't really think they could do it, and they also had no precedent to take action for like humanitarian reasons. It wasn't something that they did yet. And again, and Vietov keeps on sending these messages out, like through that radio station, like you're talking about, and he would get to Polish farmers and neighboring the camp, and that would get the information to London, and even after the United States entered the war, and they just still decide not to do it. And the reasoning is they just always kept with that original British decision, you know.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
he even says, "All right, fine, don't bomb the camp. Bomb the rail lines leading to the camp
Yep.
and stuff like that. Do something." And they said
Yeah.
it was one of the great might have beens in history, like why you didn't bomb that camp or do something.
Yeah. Books, tons of books written about it.
Yeah,
So his resistance movement in 1942 created basically like a homemade radio transmitter
yeah.
that they got from like smuggled in parts.
And they're doing this
And
because they feel like they have to help themselves. Like they're like allies
yep.
aren't going to help us. Now we have to do something ourselves, like a true
Yep.
uprising.
Yep. So so these inmates are using this radio transmitter to try, like you said, get to the locals, just to get to the locals, to get information out, to get provisions in, whatever they needed. And it took them about 7 months to build this secret radio station, um, and it broadcast until like late 1942. But then it was basically dismantled because Pilecki believed that some people within the camp started to kind of become suspicious of him and others that were in his group. So he goes, before we get discovered and all of us get killed, we need to get rid of this. So they broke it apart towards the end of 1942. And at that point, that's when Pilecki's like, all right, you're seeing this shift. And he starts talking about in his messages about Jews being killed. And he starts talking about, particularly, you had in Auschwitz, you had block 11, 10 and 11. Medical experiments were done in block 10, and punishment was done in block 11. There was actually a wall where they would shoot people against. That wall still stands. It's like a courtyard between the two buildings. And that's where you have block 11 is also the first time you have anyone gassed during this time towards the end. So he's noticing this big shift of a political camp, like a political prisoner camp, to like beginning of an extermination camp, or at least a camp where people are ultimately I guess, in a slow way brought to their death. And that's what it kind of freaks him out a little bit. He's like, all right, we gotta let people know about this. And that's he also mentioned this fact. He helps people escape, but at the same time, he's starting to think that maybe, like, if he's ever going to get out, it's time for him to get out as well.
Well, he's getting weaker too.
Yep.
He's been there for 2.5 years. He's getting physically weaker. The mental toll's taken on him. So yeah, he decides, right, it's time for him to leave, and that the only way it's going to get that camp liberated now is if there's some sort of like uprising, and he's going to have to help, liberate that camp.
Organize it. Yep.
Yeah. So he gets some of his friends to help him sneaks out. He sneaks out through the bakery in the early hours of April 27th. From there, he was able to get
1943.
to Warsaw.
1943.
April 27th, 1943. So he sneaks into Warsaw, and he was actually briefly reunited with his wife and children. And he right away goes right back to working resistance. But everyone who knows him says he's probably suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. That's what they would call it nowadays. Because he just couldn't reconnect with like his friends and his family, and all he did was write day and night about the horrors he'd witnessed. And he just couldn't handle it. It was a lot for him. And the summer of 44, I guess we'll skip to that right now, Pete.
Yeah.
They see that the Soviets are advancing on the German army. So the Polish resistance, like, listen, we have to do something. We need to kick the Germans out ahead of the Soviets' arrival, or at least fight them. So when the Soviets come, we'll team up against the Germans, because they want to make sure they can reestablish a sovereign state. They didn't really trust what the Soviets were going to do. And he was one of the thousands of who fought in the Warsaw Uprising, which was the largest action taken by a European resistance group in World War II. And the Soviets purposely they saw what was going on, and they purposely held back their advance so that the Nazis could
Finish off the Poles.
And then they came in and took over. So it actually delayed, liberating Auschwitz, which we talked about before, happened on January 27, 1945. And by then, 1.1 million people have been killed in that camp, estimated.
Yep. And that story in itself, the story of Warsaw Uprising, is something maybe one day we could touch upon.
Yeah.
But it's a crazy story. The Soviets basically, the Poles are like, we're going to liberate our capital before the Soviets get there because we don't trust the Soviets. So we'll kick the Germans out. And basically when the Soviets get to the capital, we're going to be like, haha, we're here. We got it. We could work together now. But the Soviets stopped, like you said, right before entering the capital. We're like, we're going to let the Germans finish them off. But the reason we're talking about this is because Pilecki does fight in this Warsaw Uprising. So after this guy escapes from Auschwitz, he then, again, he was sick there, I think, based on what I read, right? Didn't he have like, there's like tuberculosis? It wasn't tuberculosis. He had like two different things.
Typhus. Yeah, they all had something from just being in the camp.
And he escapes and basically rejoins the underground movement and fights, like physical fighting in the Warsaw Uprising. And second reason why we're telling you about this is because, as you mentioned, Tom, this slows down the Russian advance to trying to liberate Auschwitz. So July 1945, war is ending, and Pilecki he survives Warsaw Uprising. He gets out of there, and he winds up joining the Polish military intelligence under Polish General Anders in Italy. So he basically joins the Polish Second Corps, which was the Polish army that was sponsored and fought alongside the British. During this time, while this is all happening, so now we go to like towards the end of 1945, Poland is occupied now by the Soviets, the so-called liberators. The Soviet Union has swept through Eastern Europe, halfway through Germany, which eventually becomes East Germany, and basically kind of refuses to leave.
The Soviets were just allowed to do that. Like, it was this kind of like the agreement that the Allies said, all right, you can take half of Europe. You take the eastern part of Europe. That was kind of just like the deal.
Allowed.
And so for a lot of people in the West, they think May 1945 was the end of the Second World War. But for a lot of people in Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe, it lasted for another 4 decades, because they were particularly from Poland, right? They were a communist puppet state.
Yep.
So
Till 1990.
until 1990, yeah. So it's a whole, it's a whole other thing. He actually does go back to Auschwitz at one point, and he sees that some of his friends there that survived are actually giving tours of people, the touring people around, so they're aware of what happened there. But he doesn't survive much longer.
And that's a good point you brought that up, because what's basically happens now, so he's working as a military intelligence officer for Poland, right? I mean, talk about a guy that earned his pay. He's ordered by the Polish general of this Polish Second Corps to go back into Poland to start reporting on the political situation under the Soviet occupation. So it's like, well, we're supposedly free, but we're really not. The Soviets are creating this puppet state, as you mentioned. So your job is to infiltrate them and then send back reports back to the Polish government in exile, which is located in London, and to London, as to what is happening in communist Poland. Changes identity. He lives under various different names, changes jobs frequently. At one point, he's like a painter, he's a jewelry salesman, construction warehouse manager. And then eventually what happens in July 1946, his information is uncovered by the Ministry of Public Security, a communist organization. The Poles in London actually order him to leave. They're like, I think they got you. Like, you got to get out.
Yeah.
Yep. And he refuses. He's like, no, I'm going to stay, and I'm going to keep on trying to get more intelligence. So he refuses, chooses to stay. But May 8th, 1947, the communist authorities arrest him. So what happens to him?
Well, he's basically gets arrested, and then for the next year or so, he's basically just tortured repeatedly.
Yep.
He's put on trial, pretty a sham trial.
Of course,
and he's executed
televised.
as an enemy of the state the next year. And according to a Polish newspaper, as he was led to his death, it's like that quote that he says, I've been trying to live my life so that in the hour of my death, I would rather feel joy than fear.
Yeah.
And he's shot in the back of the head, and no one knows where he's buried, where his remains went.
Yeah.
And really, a lot of reports about him were hidden away in the Polish archives until the 1990s, like we've talked about before. And like now, he's been given a lot of awards and hailed as a hero. There's been some documentaries coming about him. I read a couple places that they are planning on making. I see that, I don't know exactly who. There's an Austrian director that's apparently working on a movie based on his life. And there's been smaller movies made on his life, foreign language movies, but no like Western. Maybe they should make a movie on him instead of making 5 more Indiana Jones and more Transformer movies.
I mean, I would still see more Indiana Jones and Transformers.
Yes, I'm not saying anything wrong with those movies, but there's
this is a crazy
interesting stories out there that can be talked about. But he's basically a symbol for many Poles that were forced to bury like their experience in the war for decades. Yeah. And he's definitely a hero.
Yeah. Once he's, when he's arrested and this whole sham of a trial that's going on, he refuses to reveal any information. He protects all other operatives because they're like, what other operatives are here from the Western, because again, he's answering to a Polish government that's basically in London. So he's answering to the London allies. So they're, Soviets are like, who else is here that's spying for London? And he refuses to say anything. So once he is found guilty and sentenced to death, actually there's tons, like hundreds of pleas for pardon come from Auschwitz survivors that know him. And they're like, no, like, please, no. And again, it doesn't really work. It doesn't matter. And he, like you said, he's executed through the most known Soviet form of execution. He was shot to the back of the head in prison in Warsaw.
And his children who are still alive, like they actually honor the father. They go there every year where he was killed, and they light candles, and hundreds of people join her every year to like honor him and remember everything about him.
Yeah, but we have no idea. We don't really know where.
Well, I saw there are a lot of statues and memorials outside of Warsaw to him. So the Poles have not forgotten him. He hasn't been forgotten in that part of the world.
Just kind of outside.
Yeah,
and I guess, because he was controversial, and it doesn't really fit with the whole narrative of everyone's helping. And you remember, this is such a controversial topic, right, Tom? That as to whether the Allies knew what they knew and why didn't they do anything, right? There's tons of books written about this.
Yeah, it was more of what they knew. I'm sure they knew, had some idea, right?
Yeah.
It's just of what they knew and what could they have done, what should they have done. And again, their mindsets of it was it was just risky going that deep in, or it was something that those resources were better used to try to win the war than just bomb the camp. Like, how is it going to look if they bomb a prison of war camp? Like, how is that going to make them look? I guess you could look at that perspective also.
First real publication of Witold's report, which he winds up writing shortly after escaping. It's about 100 pages long, and like we said earlier, it is delivered to the Allies. The first real publication for mass consumption was written or published in 2000, so like 55 years after the war. And then afterwards, additional documents were discovered in 2009, and the first English translation was published in 2012. The name of that book is Auschwitz Volunteer, Beyond Bravery. If you guys are interested, you could read his own words, what he witnessed there. But yeah, this was a little different. And, we always like figured out and toyed around with the idea of like, well, we should do something on Auschwitz. And we're like, it's going to be definitely a more than one part kind of podcast. And then we're like, well, maybe we should do something about the Holocaust. And we're like, all right, that's going to be a really big podcast. Once we started looking into that, I feel like this kind of came up, and it seemed like an interesting story to really bring up the Holocaust on our podcast without yet gearing up for doing the big Holocaust podcast somewhere down the line.
Definitely one of our more intense podcasts as far as content, as the level of content. But I think it's an important story to tell out there, because it's one that a lot of people just aren't aware of. Again, they probably heard of it. Maybe they heard of, the guy who snuck into Auschwitz. Yeah, I remember hearing something about that. But some of the details, why he went in, how he did it, how he got out, just stuff like that. And just, it's exposing the world really to what were the horrors years before it became more well known.
Public knowledge. Yeah.
Public knowledge.
All right, guys. So thank you so much for joining us once more on our podcast. And I hope that you guys keep on tuning in. We really do appreciate it. If you need to find us, you can find us at www.historyteacherstalkingpodcast.com. We are always here to answer any of your questions, and we welcome any comments. So thank you so much. And I hope you guys have an awesome week.
Stay safe, everybody.
I hope everyone enjoyed our podcast, and if you would like to email us, you can do so at historyteacherspodcast@gmail.com.